I'd like to welcome you and thank you for being here. As I said, my name is Dave Sapp. The ACLU of California protects the fundamental right of students to equal educational opportunity, and we particularly focus on ensuring that right for the most vulnerable student populations. That's low-income students, students of color, LGBTQ youth, English learners, and others. And I'm very pleased to have this session to talk about a very hot topic, and in particular how charter schools can impact the educational experience of students. A brief word about our interest in this issue and why we're here and why we're actually going to be supporting the policy initiatives they're going to hear about at the end of this session is that we receive a lot of intakes and requests for legal assistance from students and parents. And something that we've seen a lot of recently and have gotten a lot of questions about is students who've actually been denied enrollment or asked to leave a charter school because they are not doing well academically. And in fact, very recently, and there's a handout that was on your chair when you came in that is a news article about this, there was one school in San Bernardino that actually had a written policy that said if a student's GPA dropped below 2.0, the student would be asked to leave the school. And so basically, the issue there is that charter schools are supposed to be part of the K-12 public school system. There's a requirement in the Constitution that it be a common system of public schools. And I think the basic takeaway for us is that the whole premise behind charter schools is that we want to give parents and students choice. We want to expand the opportunities and choice. It's about giving choice to parents and students, not allowing schools to choose which students they want to educate. So this session is going to be giving, I think, a broad overview of a number of issues that we're seeing that are emerging related to charter schools. And again, I'm really pleased that you're here and want to welcome you.
I'm here today to talk to you about this report on public accountability for charter schools that we put together with lots of help from Communities for Public Education Reform and other folks around the country. Just to set the context for a moment, I think it's important to realize that out of 50 million students in our nation's public schools, only about 2.6 million are in charter schools. It just helps us set context and think about how much funding and how much resources go to this particular issue versus how many students nationwide are in our traditional public schools as well. And it's really important to think about that context and that scope. That said, there's a really very quickly increasing enrollment of students in charter schools. So this bar chart on the bottom, if you can follow it, shows the just dramatic increase in numbers of students attending charter schools around the country. Where are the 6,440 charter schools? Here's a map that we put together that shows where those charter schools are. You can see that the majority, or the state with the largest number of charter schools, is right here at home in California. As of our best records, there's 1,130 charter schools in the state, which makes us I think a leader in a lot of ways. I think having the greatest number of charter schools means that we as a state also have the greatest responsibility to think about how we hold public charter schools accountable publicly. These are public institutions, just like other education institutions. Now, we use the term public accountability a lot in this report, and I just want to be clear that public accountability isn't test scores. It's not the accountability that you all are often used to citing in Sacramento. We have, if you turn to the very, very back of the report on page 14, we list out the 4 points of what we mean by, what this group meant by public accountability. First, that there's a level playing field between traditional public schools and public charter schools. The idea is to share information and best resources between these different models. The idea of charter schools was initially this laboratory to design and innovate creative ideas for how to educate and reach children. We want to make sure that that spirit of what charter schools were intended to be holds true, and that information is shared between traditional public schools and charter schools rather than having them compete against each other. We want charter schools to be fully transparent and accountable to the communities that they serve. We want to make sure that charter schools, just like our public education system that is meant to serve all children in this nation, that charter schools also serve an equitable cross-section of the population of students that are in a particular district or the district in which they're situated. And also that the charter authorizers actually have the capacity to do what we've charged them to do, which is to monitor charter schools. In many, many states, there's been an exponential increase in the number of charter schools without increasing any capacity for the authorizers to actually monitor the charter schools. Real quickly, our process for developing these recommendations, this came out of a working group that the Annenberg Institute facilitated for Communities for Public Education Reform, which was a collaborative of organizations from around the country, predominantly grassroots community organizers. And we pulled together the folks that were from some of the largest charter districts in the country. So this was a national working group. And we did an inquiry into existing public education laws. We looked at the different charter accountability regulations that were proposed by different agencies and reform support organizations. And then we synthesized all the findings and just the public understanding and knowledge from these people in the working group into this final report. There's 7 recommendations in the report. The first idea is that traditional districts and charter schools should work together to ensure a coordinated approach that serves all children. Again, the idea is that public education is meant to serve all young people. That's our promise as a nation, is that we will educate all children. We shouldn't have some groups of students who have access to some kinds of learning and some groups of students who have access to other kinds of learning. Basically, the idea here is that public education is a collective good. And all children, regardless of their income, regardless of their race, regardless of their family status, should have access to that public collective good. Under this category, we talk about the fact that traditional school districts and charter schools within a city setting should come together and set a plan to try and understand enrollment patterns, to try and understand the demographics of the schools, if there's plans for opening or closing new schools. This is simply the idea that if a school district is thinking, we see the projected population of our city going like this, but there's 4 or 5 charter schools that are going to be opened up for middle school that fall, and there's no communication between the district, you suddenly have a bunch of schools open for the same group of students. You need to have coherence and communication between the different sectors. One of the ideas that came out of the group as well was that there should be some sort of impact statement before opening a new charter school. This kind of comes out of the environmental policy world, right? An environmental impact statement before you site a new building or you put in something new. Is charter schools are part of a public education system. They operate in their own venue at times, but they're still part of a public education system. So if a new one is going to be cited or created, thinking about its impact on the rest of that system is extraordinarily important. School governance should be representative and transparent. This is pretty intuitively obvious. We have lots of legislation in California that says that public records should be available and should be accessible to people. The same should be true of public charter schools that are serving public school students with your public money. This includes things like the original application for a charter school should be available online. People should see what the purpose of the charter is. Members of the charter governing board should include representatives of parents and students. And that also people sitting on these governing boards should be in the communities in which the schools are cited. That members of the governing board should actually file full financial disclosure reports. There's been article after article coming out over mismanagement. Now, we know a lot of charter schools do a really good job managing their money. And we also know that there's been a lot of fraud. And this is, again, our public tax dollars, and we need to really think about that aspect of it. Meeting minute notes should be available. All public meetings should be at times where they're accessible, and that people have a knowledge of when they're happening and have a capacity to actually attend them. And then the current state laws and Freedom of Information Act requirements that are required for other public schools should also be required for charter schools. There's management contracts that we fit within this area also, and that's on the next page, on page 6. This again is more of the full financial disclosure, and really prohibiting people who have a financial interest in the school from sitting on the charter boards themselves. There's just a conflict of interest that seems to occur more than once. Charter schools should ensure equal access to interested students and prohibit practices that discourage enrollment or disproportionately push enrolled students out of school. This is what we just heard about a second ago in the introduction. The idea that certain students are being counseled into or out of particular schools. Again, this is actually, there's federal and state laws that say that that kind of discrimination is not allowable, and we need to make sure that it's not happening in charter schools in the state and in the country. That one is pretty straightforward in terms of enrollment, but the same is true in terms of retention. If schools are counseling students with special needs out, if schools are counseling students who are going to lower the overall test scores out, this stuff should not be going on. These are kids who should be getting a public education. Again, public good, public education. These are young people who want to learn. They shouldn't be shoved in and out of schools to boost or take away test scores. There's all kinds of ideas in here, like creating an ombudsman's office so that parents who feel like inequities are happening have a way to report and handle the inequities. We have also the idea that there should be public documentation of the attrition that happens throughout the year. We should know why students are leaving. It should be publicly accessible, and anyone should be able to find out why the reasons behind students leaving the school. There's been a lot of work. In fact, California's led the way on school discipline policies. There's so many practices that we know about now from the education research on restorative justice, on other policies that actually reduce the role of police presence in schools and create safe environments for our young people to attend school. We know that African American students in particular, but students of color more generally, and students with special needs are disproportionately impacted by discipline policies. There's a great report that just came out from the UCLA Civil Rights Project this week that again documents this huge inequality. This is incredibly critical that charter schools, like other public schools, are required to post their school discipline policies online so a parent who's applying to that school has an idea of what the policy is. Not just posting it online, but that policy needs to be just and needs to use the best available research about how to adequately educate children and help them when they're not succeeding due to discipline or behavior issues. Again, this is requiring, we suggest some kind of annual reporting as well. There's been a huge issue around school facilities, not surprisingly, between charter schools and other public schools. A lot of charter schools are co-located in the same facilities as other public schools. And what we heard from the groups that we convened was a tremendous amount of competition on a day-to-day basis, or even the feeling or the vibe that there were two schools within the school in terms of quality of school. So one half of the school has access to Wi-Fi and laptops and iPads, and the other half of the school doesn't even have AC functioning. This kind of inequality on a day-to-day basis that young people experience and see, it not only is unjust, it's not acceptable that this happens. And when schools are co-located together, there should be a strong emphasis on the two different schools coming together, thinking about how they're using their facilities, how they can maximize resources so that all students in both schools get the resources they need. The online charter schools being better regulated for quality, transparency, and protection of student data. You're going to hear a lot more about this in a moment. There's some strong concerns about the data that's being collected as students use these online programs and whether or not that data is being shared or not with other private companies. There's also very little known about how the rapid expansion of online charter schools is impacting overall education, and it's not clear. Enrollment in and out throughout the year is also a problem as students come in and out of the online schools, and how students enrolling in an online school also has an effect on the existing public schools that they're leaving, or if they're coming back in the middle of the year, what the impact is based on those other schools. Again, this is an education system, a statewide education system, and we need to think of it as that. Last but not least, this is what I mentioned at the beginning, is that there needs to be better monitoring and oversight of charter schools. the agencies at the state level and in the county offices of education and in the school districts that are responsible for monitoring charter schools' charters don't have the capacity to do their jobs. As we increase the number of charter schools, we also have to increase the support for and the funding for the people who are meant to do the oversight. And that absolutely needs to be state funded. You can't, this idea of a charter school paying for or hiring its own person to monitor them is obviously a conflict of interest. So dealing with that issue is also critical. The bottom line is, as charter schools expand, as we have more and more charter schools around the country, we need to start thinking about the collective impact of all of those schools on the entire public education system and how the portfolio models of school districts and of a state, how we work together and how we build new laws and regulations that address this new constellation that we didn't have 20 years ago.
Any best practices in other states that you think address some of the fundamental concerns that you brought up in your presentation that maybe we could look to here in California that have worked well in other places?
I think what we know is that there's other states that are in the process right now of testing out and trying these different regulations. So within the different areas, there's absolutely places to look. And I want to make sure I tell you the exact right places. But in New York City, advocates for children are working on disciplinary codes, in particular in the New York public school system. The Auditor General in Pennsylvania is acknowledging overall oversight from an auditor standpoint and thinking about what they can be doing. People are newly thinking about this, but again, this is where California, we have more charter schools than any of the other states in the country, and so we do have an obligation, I think, to lead the nation in how we handle this. There's 6 states that are considering a moratorium on new charters until the monitoring can catch up with the new charters. That's Connecticut, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maine, and Massachusetts. And the idea is you need the oversight to keep up with and keep track of all the new charters that are happening. So those 6 states are considering bills. I think in each of these areas, some of these ideas came from best practices in individual schools or in individual districts. Some of them also came from the National Charter Schools Associations. I should say specifically the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. So they have a whole set of standards, and we looked at those standards alongside what we heard the parents were saying. I've heard about that happening. Again, this is our whole call for this information needs to be publicly available, because right now tracking down that information national trend-wise is so hard. In the background of doing this report, right, we brought together these different organizations. We had a team of graduate students looking across the 50 states, trying to pull up just the charter authorization legislation for each of the states and then each of the districts. And even that simple information, other than the bills that come out of the state legislature that obviously have a public record behind them, is so hard to find. So to talk about national trends and that specific issue is really, really challenging, because finding so much of the information about charter schools is not publicly reported. And in fact, there's a lot of cases, even when there's direct FOIA requests, that have been denied because of the fact that a lot of charter money is given to private corporations to run, and then the private corporations aren't required to report their fiscal information. Whether it's fiscal information or geographic information, they have a lot less heavy reporting requirements. And so that, tracking that, we hear a lot of anecdotes, and this is one of the absolute most frustrating things about trying to help find solutions, is that we don't even have, as researchers, the information to start with, because it's so cryptic and hidden. It's hard, because finding someone to publicly say, my child was denied services at this school, and that's why a lot of this stuff happens in, I will tell you from what we heard, a lot of this stuff happens in the back rooms, one-on-one with a college counselor, someone saying, sweetheart, this is just not the school for you. People like you ought to be somewhere else. And it's very subtle, and it's very individualized, and it's very hard to track. But I can tell you that nationally, we keep hearing that story. But
so, and I'll just echo, which is that I cannot, despite great effort to try to do so, give you an exact answer to that question. What I can say is that there's a spectrum of what it looks like. I think some is subtle, some is less so. I've personally spoken with students, parents, teachers, members of our team have done so, where there was a much more explicit conversation. The example that I noted in San Bernardino was an actual written policy that set a specific GPA minimum. That was the most transparent policy that we've come across, and that's why we focus some attention there. But we're currently looking at other policies. I know that Public Advocates released a report late last year that looked at various admissions requirements, including volunteer requirements, that can also serve as a gatekeeping function or as a way of sort of counseling out, and that's the term of, well, if this isn't a student that's a good fit, having those sort of pieces in place to point to as a way to push the student out, but that there are actually some instances where it is explicit. And at least as of now, there's no comprehensive way to sort of push back on that.
We also heard a lot about documentation requirements nationally, right? So at least in California, we're more on the front end of immigration rights policy than many, many, many other states are. So asking for certain kinds of documentation as a way to weed out immigrant children, we heard that story a lot from these focus groups. We also heard this story of there's one anecdote that's in here from Philadelphia of, in order to attend the school the following year, there was one day you had to attend an open hearing, and that open hearing was at a country club that was 2 miles from the closest public transportation. So the fact that those sorts of policies, we hear anecdote after anecdote after anecdote. Again, it hits the thing of like actually systemically tracking numbers and quantity of how often this happens is very, very tricky. But we're hearing it quite a lot, which is why I think all of our organizations that deal with making sure public education is available to all kids, particularly low-income students and students of color, it's just very, very concerning. And again, that trend of parent volunteer requirements, nationally we saw quite a lot too, or we heard quite a lot. And again, that's one of the ones where these just reminding all of us over and over again that these are public schools still, and that they're meant to serve all children is absolutely critical.
And I would just build on that. In California, from a policy and justice and human perspective, absolutely. But there's also an additional perspective here in California. Constitutionally, there's a requirement that we have a single system, a common system of public schools. And in fact, when the Charter School Act was first passed, it was challenged on various constitutional grounds, including that it violated that constitutional provision. The court that considered that question explicitly said, no, this statute is constitutional because charters have to be free and open to all students on equal terms. So there's that additional framework in California that charters actually are a part of our K-12 public education system that I think reinforce, in particular, the first of the policy recommendations about making sure that this is a seamless system that fits together. There's actually a mandate from our Constitution that in fact be the case as well.
I think it could be that the charter school law is brand new, and so there just haven't been any new. So the law has passed, but I'm seeing nods from the audience. The law has passed, but that no charters have been put in. So I wouldn't say that I have heard, and I'll look to some of the other experts in the room as well. I've not heard of a state that has had active anti-charter legislation. That's the hope. So we're presenting these accountability standards all over the country. So this weekend they're being presented at the National NEA meeting in Anaheim. They're also being presented at the Education Writers Association in Denver. Our hope is that in some of these states that have not had charter legislation or are in the process of reauthorizing their charter legislation, that these standards could serve as a guidepost exactly for what you're saying, is get it at the front end rather than, California is one of the first states to have charters. So we have a longer history to clean up, maybe. Is that fair to say?
We're here not just in support of the broader bill package that Seth's going to talk about later, as well as the general concepts, but Also wanted to speak a little bit to how these issues, and one bill in particular, reflect what we see as the fundamental values of labor and our fundamental rights as workers. So what we see as workers, when we talk about the freedom to join a union and your right to join a union, it's for us about a lot more than just a contract. And when we talk about a contract, we focus on improving the wages, stronger benefits, safer working conditions of workers. And contracts are very much about that, but they're also about something deeper, and that's your freedom as a worker to focus on doing your job well and not just keeping your job. That without the benefit of a contract, and when you're working in a situation where you have virtually no job security, where you're not part of a structure and you're not part of a community at your workplace where you can address some of the concerns and hazards that might be there, what it really does is it diminishes your ability as a worker to focus on what it is that you're there to do, whether it's electrical work or whether it's healthcare, or if you're a lobbyist, or especially if you're an educator or a classified employee in a school. That if you're that worried about your own security, about your own safety and your own financial health, then it harms your ability to take care of the kids, to make sure the kids have everything that they need, and that the whole system works as well as it should. And so for us, it's critically important that we protect the right of those workers to join a union and not just have the benefits of those contracts so that they don't need another job, so that they make a living wage and that they can stay on the job in education, but also that if concerns do arise and they do see things that are harming the quality of education in their school, that they've got the freedom to talk about that, and that there's a process in place where they won't be retaliated against. They've got reps there. They've got a process there that they're taking care of, that they participate in, that can help protect the quality of those institutions. And so the Hernandez bill in particular, we think, reflects that, and that's why we're co-sponsoring that one. But all of these bills that you're going to hear about later as a whole, we think, take a great step forward in terms of protecting the quality of education at charter institutions and the educational infrastructure as a whole from the perspective of classified employees and educators, that everywhere we go, workers will have their fundamental rights protected, and as a result, the students in these schools will have their rights as students protected, and we can help make sure that the whole infrastructure works as well as it's supposed to. And with that, I'd like to introduce Donald Cohen, who is the head of an organization called In the Public Interest, who do a lot of fantastic work on these issues, but especially those of contracting out and privatization. And he'll speak a lot about sort of how those concepts fit into the education world. And here is Mr. Cohen.
What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about two projects of ours in sequence. I'm going to try to, I got a lot to cover. I'll try to be both as quick but as understandable as possible. The first is about a report that we released yesterday on California Virtual Academies, that I'm going to go over some of the findings of that report, or CAVA for short. We have some teachers here from CAVA that will speak later. CAVA is fundamentally the schools are managed by K-12 Inc., one of the largest national virtual charter schools, and I'll get to the exact relationship later. The second project is polling. We've recently conducted some national polling and some California-based polling to identify charter reform, some of the same things that we were talking about before. So I want to make just 3 points on why, going to the study of CAVA, which is really a deep dive into the operations of this one charter chain, a virtual charter chain. They're actually a charter chain. Their schools are virtual. 3 points. One is that, from our perspective, there has been this enormous growth and the pressure to grow the number of charters around the country, brick and mortar and virtual charters throughout the country. And there's a huge lag between the growth, the push for growth, and the need to catch up with common sense rules and regulations and accountability that, similar to what's in the Annenberg study. The second is that there is actually there's not very much research on virtual charters, on the impacts, on the benefits, on the downsides, on the results. And the third, the biggest companies are for-profit companies that have a particular set of incentives. And we always look at, in all the areas of work that we do, we look at where private interests can sometimes trump public interests. So we pay particular attention to that. These are the 4 areas. Oh, well, just first, real quick, CAVA has 11 locations in California. They opened in 2002. with 650 students and now have 14,500 students in California. We looked at 4 principal areas, and if you look at the reports, I think, in the packet, some of the versions I saw, the end notes and the source notes were almost as long as the actual text. It's quite well documented. I am not the author of the report. So these are the 4 areas we looked at: and we found poor academic performance, a troubled educational environment that we'll hear more about later from teachers, the questions about the relationships between CAVA and K-12 California, which is a subsidiary of K-12 Inc. nationally. And then we looked as best as we could at K-12 Inc.'s expenditures, given that they're a private company. So what we found is I'll just go over them, from 2010-11 year to the following year, CAVA's overall graduation rate was 36%. In 2013, when CAVA's graduation rate was the highest it has ever been at 58%, the overall graduation rate in the state was 80%, so substantially different and lower. In the years between 2010 and 2013, the state dropout rate was 14%, but in that same period, the dropout rate at CAVA was 47%. So we see substantially different outcomes in these two, in schools overall and in CAVA. We looked at academic performance index, and we looked at the ratings, which is California ratings. We looked at ratings comparing them, CAVA schools, to all schools, and we also looked and we compared them to what are referred to as similar schools, based on, and there's a particular method by which I'm not going to go into how they identify similar schools. So as an example, in 2012-13, 57% of schools with similar student populations performed better than CAVA. And then at the same period, 71% of all schools in the state performed better than CAVA. Again, another indicator of poor academic performance. These are the takeaways from the data: that we saw no evidence of improvement in any CAVA location or the CAVA system as a whole, that the program is developed, because to show that the program is developing over time. Their API growth score, which is a particular method that measures from year to year, was negative, meaning not better. And I'm not going to go through the math on that each year. But I'm going to mention the sort of takeaway from this, when we looked at performance, is that we did not see this consistent trend upwards. We see, schools struggle all over. There are ups and downs in brick and mortar, charter, non-charter schools. But we saw California schools there's a consistent trend, but we found no signs of that trend in CAVA at all. Consistent positive trends in other places. The huge complaints about materials and equipment that are either not available or substandard. Remember, the equipment meaning computers and books and sort of all the things that one would need if you were being schooled at home, online, very consistent. Attendance policies that were far too lax and leading students to fall through the cracks. In many cases, teachers said that all they had to do was log in 1 minute of login to constitute a full day of attendance to get their ADA. A significantly lower ratio of clerical support to teachers than other schools, and brick and mortars and other schools. And teachers are having to do a lot of the paperwork and the clerical work. And then an inadequate provision of special ed services. I do want to add something that's not on the slide about an issue that was discussed previously about the difficulty, the tendency of charters to push out students of color and other communities, which is a real issue broader. But there's actually a slightly different take that we heard from teachers. Excuse me, I keep saying that. Is that there are many students for whom online schools work. It's the right choice. But there are lots of students for whom it doesn't work. Somehow I got that. Just keep doing it. So teachers found that it was incredibly difficult sometimes to actually de-enroll a student that's really for whom online is not appropriate, to move them back into a traditional brick and mortar school. The pressure being from K-12 Inc., who has control of the school because they manage the schools, who wants the ADA. So it's a slightly different take on, obviously we believe and schools should be completely accessible to all students, but on an online situation, sometimes the student really should be somewhere else. So it's a different story. And the pressure for profit really does play an AD and daily attendance plays a huge role. Let me talk about the relationship between CAVA and K-12, and I want to go a little bit more slowly on this. We looked at that relationship. So we analyzed the contracts between K-12 California, the for-profit, and the various CAVA individual locations each with their own board, albeit overlapping. Similar. And we found that K-12 California retains an enormous amount of control. The contractor for the school retains an enormous degree of control over the operations. And many of the operational practices we found were particularly concerning. So I want to share a few things. First off, K-12 controls both the bank account and pays itself for the service. They're in complete control. They're the manager and the vendor. And in fact, CAVA, the contracting agency, is contractually prohibited from seeking another vendor for services that K-12 is willing and able to provide. So that's an enormous level of control. For administrative and tech services that CAVA does provide, they collect a percentage of revenue rather than a fee for service per pupil. So if the ADA if California would increase its per pupil funding, they would get more money as opposed to more money going into the classroom. And then there's a funny thing that I'll need to go over slowly, the strange thing that we're calling debt, but it's really kind of a permanent deficit spending that keeps the schools in debt to K-12, and I'll walk you through it. First, K-12 each year charges the CAVA locations more per year to provide the services than the school can actually pay. So what K-12 does is they issue what's called budget credits every year, without which the CAVA location would be insolvent. They wouldn't be able to pay the bills. This allows K-12 to ensure that it receives any extra money that walks in the door that may be left over at the end of the year. And it provides an enormous amount of leverage over actual operational decision-making throughout the year. There are constantly, every school is in debt all the time. Because K-12 is a private company, we do not have access to some of the data that we'd like to know. So we can't identify how much they spend on non-educator related things. We looked at marketing expenditures, we looked at executive compensation, and we found from other sources, not from their sources, that we estimate with good estimations that approximately 5% of revenue spent on advertising. And actually, let me give you the numbers. CAVA produced about $47 million in revenue for K-12 Inc., and K-12 Inc. is based in Virginia, and that represents about 49% of the $95 million in public funding that CAVA locations received each year. So they got half the money. The teachers work for CAVA. So we estimated about 5% was spent on advertising, and we found, again, in other sources, the CEO of K-12 was paid $3.96 million in 2011-12. In that year, the superintendent of public education is paid $150,000, and an average CAVA teacher makes $36,150, which, if you're doing the math, is 100. So his salary is 109 times the average CAVA teacher salary. In terms of recommendations, I think the Annenberg report has a great deal of detailed recommendations. We just sort of, and we have some more detailed ones in our report. But just as at the 30,000-foot level, we have two fundamental directions. One is there has to be increased oversight of virtual schools. I know there are bills being submitted here in California for that. There's more to do on that, but it's absolutely essential. And that, we use data that we could get our hands on. We use contracts, we use budget, we use stuff from the Department of Education, but there is, we believe there's a far greater need for sort of deep dives and investigations into CAVA's audits and finances and operations, and we're making these recommendations to the state. Now I'm going to switch entirely to a reform agenda. The polling that we did. This is a poll of 700 registered voters in California. 62% rate the quality of education at public schools in their neighborhood as excellent or good. Voters are more likely to say public schools in their neighborhood are getting better rather than getting worse, with a plurality saying the same. And then by a margin of 7-1, voters are more likely to have favorable than unfavorable view of public school teachers. Very popular. One of the things we found, which was really striking, is that, because we hear all the time that parents want choice, everybody wants choice, that's the solution to our education problems. And we've found that in a poll of people, voters, that there were far more important things, and in fact, the lack of school choice was the dead last on their areas of concern. They cared about parental involvement, school funding, class sizes, all the things that are, what I think are common sense, things that most people do care about. They don't know much about charter schools. 52% of voters favor them, 15% oppose, 33% do not have enough information. And at the same time, 56% want to keep the number of charters the same or reduce the number in their area, while 34% want to increase the number. And this is all based on sort of really a fuzzy idea of what charters are. For example, 50% believe charters are not public schools, that they're private, then while 38% think they are public schools. Enormous confusion over that. The most important thing, and maybe we'll take an extra couple of minutes, but I think it's in the, but not more than that. We tested a set of reforms, transparency, accountability reforms, and you have the memo, and it gives you the numbers in that. And we found overwhelming support. Democrats, independents, Republicans, pro-charter, anti-charter for this set of reforms, for a pretty robust package. I'm going to read just a couple of them, the actual reforms, but some of them over 80%. And so, for example, requiring companies and organizations that manage charter schools to open board meetings to the public, like ordinary school board meetings, 92% agree. Require that the charter schools release to parents and the public how they spend taxpayer money, 88%. A few more. Require state officials to conduct regular audits, 86% support. Another interesting one is about in terms of the impact on neighborhood schools. Here, ensure that neighborhood public schools do not lose funding when any new charter opens in their area. That's and 80% supported that. I'm going to cherry pick a little bit. Prohibit charter school board members and their immediate families from financially benefiting from their schools, 67%, not as strong, but in most polls that's pretty high. And then to the point earlier, require charter schools to serve high-need students, such as special ed students, at the same level of neighborhood public schools. That was 78%. Now, there's a number of other ones that I won't read and we can talk about in questions or bring up later, but you all have that in the memo, in the polling memo that we got from our pollster. So with that, I'll finish. This is a California poll. We did a mostly similar national poll with many of the same questions, but not all exactly the same questions, because this was a little bit tailored, of a larger sample size, and we're releasing that next week in a press call.
CFT would like to thank CTA for hosting this briefing. CFT is concerned with the accountability of charter schools. Really, I think in the Annenberg study, the important part is that charter schools were meant to innovate education, and so all the accountability measures that we talk about are not, do not hold them back from innovating programs, right? It is about, they are publicly funded institutions that serve public school children, and what rights should those children have and the parents and the communities have on the accountability of that. A lot of what the Annenberg study says is CFT supports those accountability measures, but especially in both the reviewing of petitions, which I think charter authorizers, if you look at what they have done recently, especially, they take a lot of time in reviewing petitions, and so to increase the amount of accountability that charter schools have increases that review process. And in their oversight process of the more accountability we have, the more oversight those charter authorizers have. In Santa Clara County, where Morgan Hill is, there are 62 charter schools. 20 of them have been authorized by our county board on either appeal from local boards or petitioning the county board itself. And so the county office has 20 charter schools to oversight. And that process, I think, holding those charter authorizers accountable for the oversight of the charter schools is also an important factor in what we choose to use as accountability measures, but also how they publicly kind of propose the oversight and and show what the charter schools have been doing, right, in public meetings. As far as the accountability measures for charter schools, especially the open board meetings, charter management organizations often have charter schools that are located in different districts because they have several different programs, and so they often do not have. They often have one charter management organization board meeting, and so to have parents be able to come to that from different districts is a difficult thing for parents to do, and that limits the amount of parent involvement in decision-making process. While charters are sometimes even petitioned by districts from parents, they sometimes lack parents in their parent involvement in their actual decision-making process as the charter continues to operate. And I am going to introduce the teachers from the California Virtual Academy, who are Jen Shilan, who teaches history and social studies, Debbie Skultuk, who teaches math, and Sarah Vigras, who is an elementary school teacher. And they're going to talk about their school and their attempts to unionize their school.
As Donald mentioned, we serve over 14,000 students statewide, and I'm one of about 760 teachers statewide. I have been teaching math, and the way it works is I sit at my computer at my home, and I use technology and programs to teach online students that are sitting in their homes in front of computers, and we communicate through technology and telephone calls and our computers. I am currently assigned 28 homeroom students and 163 geometry students. This is a reduced load at our school. This year they have tried to cap math and English numbers. Many of my teachers in other subject areas have over 200 content students in addition to their homeroom students. Who are these students? Well, they come to us from many different backgrounds. Some have been homeschooled and they continue with us. Some are professional athletes in training. Some are entertainers, actors, singers. And some have just had bad experiences in the traditional school setting. They've been bullied and other types of negative experiences. For those kids, we are a wonderful opportunity and alternative. We want you to know that we believe in this model, and we believe that it can work. However, currently, it is not working, and that's what we're here to tell you about. Many of my students, a majority of my students, are not the students I just described. They are students that saw the TV commercial and saw this as an easy way out, an easy way to do school. They want to sleep in. They want to use the computer. They want to Google their assignments. And most of their parents are working during the day, so they're left at home with their parents trusting that they are attending online courses and doing their assignments. Given this background, I'd like to tell you what it's like to teach at CAVA. This week, I've spent a total of 5 hours preparing and delivering my lessons. When I taught in a traditional setting, I spent 30 to 35 hours preparing and delivering lessons. You might wonder, well, what do I do with the rest of my time? Most of my time is spent monitoring my homeroom students. That involves collecting paperwork, making sure it's all completed, making sure they attend state testing, making sure they log in and complete assignments, monitoring attendance, and communicating this all to parents when I'm able to get a hold of them. It is not uncommon for me to hear a parent say, "Oh, I had no idea that my student was failing all of their classes or failing a class. They've told me they've done all of their work and they're doing logging in every day." And this is simply not the case in many cases. Attendance is one of teachers' most time-consuming and frustrating job duties. While we believe that attendance is extremely important to the success of our students, CAVA has turned teachers into attendance clerks. And it's taking away from the time that we could and should be teaching our students. We believe that additional staffing needs to be acquired to do these clerical types of tasks. In addition, our attendance policies are confusing to us as teachers, to our students, and our families. As Donald mentioned, 1 minute of login time constitutes a full day of attendance. We all know that a student logging in for 1 minute a day is not going to be successful in our program and not going to pass their classes. So these policies allow students to sort of hide out at CAVA.
K-12 and CAVA consistently enroll students that are not a good fit for our school and keep them enrolled even if it is not in the best interest of the child, because every student enrolled means more money for them. Student success is secondary to profits. As teachers, we see the problems firsthand, but when you work for an at-will termination school, voicing concerns is dangerous. Teachers are terminated for speaking up or not contracted for the following year with no explanation. Administration will ask us to complete surveys to give them feedback, but nothing changes, or rather nothing changes for the better. Our work responsibilities are ever-changing and increasing, and school policies are unclear and inconsistent, making it very difficult to know if you are doing a good job. Our pay is about half what we would make in a traditional public school. High workloads, high stress, and low pay lead to high teacher turnover, which negatively impacts our students. And obsolete technology, skipping materials, forcing families to pay for printing and internet access, advertising and recruiting using tax dollars to enroll children ill-suited to the program, all fly in the face of the free and appropriate public education our state promises its children. We would love to work with our administration on the issues within CAVA to make it a school where teachers feel safe, valued, and supported, and a learning environment that will maximize student success. Currently, CAVA administration is fighting our verified petition to organize by saying that we are 11 different schools because we have 11 charters throughout the state. This is simply not true. We operate as one school, we have one head of school, one central office. Teachers have students in many different schools. We are one school that maintains 11 charters to comply with California charter school law. We sincerely hope that CAVA and K-12 stop using this argument to delay the formation of our association.
I serve students in all 9 high school charters. My homeroom caseload is presently at 26 students. I have 24 students in my U.S. government course and approximately 175 economics students at the present moment. We are very committed to telling the story of what goes on at CAVA because changes are needed, and we feel it's our responsibility as professional educators to join in shining the light on some of these issues. So we come to you with a sense of gratitude to each of you in this room for paying attention and hearing these stories. As you can gather, students are not getting the education they deserve, and educators are being robbed of the opportunity to teach. We have problems with oversight at our school, as is, you can see a lot of detail about that in the public interest materials in your folder that was just put out yesterday. There was previously a question from the floor about whether any of our charters have ever lost authorization due to poor academic performance. And we do know in recent history that CAVA at Kern is now a charter that's not active any longer. That was due to poor student performance. Those students were simply moved to other authorizers. So CAVA as a system did not lose families. They just moved from one authorizer to another. Currently, right now, 6 of our 11 charters are in program improvement due to low student test scores. 5 of those are in year 5 program improvement at the moment. I have heard that after year 5, there's either state takeover or closure. So that's where we are right now with student performance. As Sarah mentioned, teachers have made many efforts at contacting our school leadership and administrators directly to address some of these concerns. These requests for help have gotten us nowhere because these particular leaders are powerless to affect actual change. This runs counter to California's emphasis and priority of a local control model. We know that authorizing school districts ultimately have the responsibility for oversight of charter schools, so we as teachers chose to reach out directly to them. Unfortunately, many of our charter authorizers are tiny rural school districts without resources to perform oversight as required by California Ed Code. Additionally, there is some concern about the fact that these authorizing school districts are paid by CAVA. These districts receive 2% of the ADA funding for each student enrolled in that CAVA charter. Another example of conflict of interest at our school is that our head of schools is actually an employee of K-12 Incorporated. And so therein lies a situation of competing loyalties. Are the shareholders more important, or are the students more important? We would say the students are more important, but that's a tough one with a publicly traded company. Our charter boards, which technically are independent nonprofits, actually lack autonomy under our current model. Their agendas are identical to each other, and they are dictated by K-12 Incorporated. As Donald alluded to, there is a debt relationship between our charters and K-12 Incorporated, and so that's a further way that our charter boards lack any power to deviate from the dictated agenda. Our school seeks to maximize profits by exploiting teachers. As we've heard from Debbie, teachers have been assigned clerical duties rather than hiring of classified staff. As we heard from Donald, the ratio of clerical support staff is just astronomically off base with other schools in our state. We've also heard of our convoluted attendance monitoring and verification policy. It seems every time I ask my administrator about what I'm actually supposed to do as far as signing off on the attendance documents, I can never get a clear answer, or I get an answer that changes over time. That's troubling to me, because to me, we should be able to refer to what the law says and then do whatever it is that the law says we're supposed to do. We have a history at our school of school policy mandating that both teachers and parents and students backdate their signatures on enrollment documents in an effort to collect additional days of ADA. As we as teachers have begun to speak up and ask important questions, we suddenly were no longer allowed to backdate documents, so we see that as a victory. Putting special education, and this is another huge issue, our special education teachers are actually on overload. I have heard from special education teachers that this has been explained, that they have a max of 28 people, and they actually get like up to 36 people on their caseloads. And that's been explained because they anticipate that some of those students will withdraw, and so they're on overload in anticipation of a student churn rate or turnover rate. This actually results in each special education teacher having to prepare and conduct 75 to 100 IEP meetings per school year, when typically it would be 28 or 30 in a traditional school. We wish, as CAVA teachers, to properly serve all students and families who choose to enroll with CAVA, including those who come to us from at-risk groups. Unfortunately, we fear that our school policy of retaining truant students might actually be an effort at a money grab. So under our model with all of the clerical duties, we as teachers are actually held back from properly supporting these at-risk students. We're powerless to actually spend the time and effort to transform these underengaged or truant students into successful students. As we've seen in the public interest report and Donald's presentation, there is a lack of transparency at our school. A lot of questions. Where does the money go? Much of this information is kept private. But what we do know is that resources are being diverted away from our California local virtual classrooms and toward this for-profit corporation in Virginia. This is a real problem for the quality of the education that our students receive. We look to those of you in this room to help us address these issues, so we truly appreciate the attention being paid now because we believe more oversight is needed. Thank you.
We have virtual staff meetings. Our staff meetings are held in like virtual classrooms. We email a ton. We call each other a lot. We IM or Skype.
Up until this year, we were also provided staff lists with names and numbers and emails. After our unionizing efforts, that all ended. We no longer have a complete staff list.
Yeah, it's very aggressively marketed, along with like Saturday morning cartoons. It's on all the time on Nickelodeon. It's a lot of pop-up ads. You'll start seeing it now that we've brought it to your attention, but K-12 ads are everywhere. I've seen, I don't have the exact number, but I think I remember seeing $20 million spent in advertising over a certain period of time. It's very aggressively marketed, so kids think like, that looks awesome and fun. And it does look awesome and fun, and it can be really great, but it's not always. And so they just call and Hava will sign them up.
I've actually had families on my roster that I've called and they didn't realize they were enrolled.
Our teachers and the general education teachers for CAVA for the K-8 program do meet with their students face-to-face 5 times a year. I work in the community day program, so I see my students 2 days a week actually, so I see them in person. I did all the self-testing for all of our students in our Redlands Community Day program, but if students are not in that program, only 10% of our students are. Teachers will meet with them to do their self-testing at a library or a bookstore or something like that, but we do meet in person for those kind of assessments.
In the high school as well as required self-testing and also annual state testing, exit exam is held in person at various test sites as needed, and accommodations under IEP are provided for one-on-one, small group, large group.
Most special education services, though, are provided virtually. Sometimes students will go to a location, to a contracted provider for speech services or occupational therapy or physical therapy services, but a lot of it is done in virtual classrooms.
I have not personally looked at our PE course shell, but I do know that our physical education students are responsible for keeping a log of their physical activity, so that when they go out and they're doing recreational sports or walking their dog or skateboarding, things like that, they keep a log of how many minutes they spend doing those activities. In addition, then they do have some assessments in the virtual course.
And we do physical
fitness. We do participate in the state physical fitness testing, so grades 5, 7, 9, we'll do that in person. When families fill out the back to school packet, if their income as reported qualifies them for the National School Lunch Program, then they qualify for internet service reimbursement.
The internet subsidy doesn't pay for the whole thing. I think that the amount that they give them would be if you were to have dial-up in your home, which wouldn't work. We have a lot of videos and things as part of our program. It just wouldn't work. So families have to have high-speed internet, but it's not paid for, which it's really, in my mind, another material. It's a really essential part of our program to have good internet service, yet it's not paid for.
As far as materials and Williams Act compliance and all of that, I've been told that electronic provision of instructional materials is sufficient. However, that doesn't work for all learning styles. Studies show printed materials, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. Common Core is something that we would like to comply with, and our professional development at our school is not what other teachers in other districts are getting, and the courses provided by K-12, in my personal and professional opinion, are not specifically made to address that. There have been a lot of efforts this year in trying to get us to encourage our students to participate in live synchronous sessions where they would have the opportunity to add that listening and speaking skills along with the typical reading and writing. But what ends up happening, and especially at the high school, is that the students attend asynchronously. So when I hold a live session, it's also recorded. Some students attend live, but the majority of my students will consume that product as a recording in the middle of the night when they're actually working and I'm sleeping, okay? So they're not speaking. They're listening to me, they're reading, they're writing, but they're not speaking. So those skills are not being addressed as they would in the face-to-face. Deb, you can talk about math probably.
Well, yeah.
I just wanted to address that. I did ask what we were doing about Common Core at the beginning of the year, as my friends in other schools have had extensive training in Common Core and implementing that and phasing that in over the last couple of years. I was told that the K-12 curriculum which we use was based on Common Core because it was developed in Virginia and they had some insight into the Common Core before the rest of us did, so that we didn't need to worry about it. We were implementing it by using the curriculum that they've provided us.
I thought all public schools were supposed to do Common Core, and then you guys are going to be testing to the Common Core soon.
We are.
So,
yeah. And just to get back to the materials question you had, the K-12 Board of Directors came to the Community Day site that I run and talked with a panel of teachers and a panel of students and a panel of parents, and one of the parents' main complaints was the lack of physical textbooks. They wanted to be able to be more portable because the computers provided by K-12 are desktops, not laptops. They wanted to be able to take work with them. That's one of the benefits of our program, is the flexibility and the ability to just do schooling anywhere, but without physical textbooks you can't do that. And one of my parents specifically said, I want a science textbook. We have no science textbook. Can we get a science textbook? And one of the members of the K-12 executives said, would you be willing to pay for it?
I just want to say a little bit about Public Advocates' interest in the issue of charter schools. Public Advocates is a nonprofit civil rights legal organization, and we use policy advocacy, legal advocacy, and partnership with community organizations to try to change policies and practices for the goal of having educational equity and access for students in public school. Last fall, Public Advocates conducted some research on the issue of access to charter schools, which are public schools. And so we did online research of over 500 charter schools, close to half of the charter schools in California. And we found that a third of them, well, what we were looking for was whether or not there were requirements for parental volunteers, volunteer work, donations, and the kind. We felt that if there were requirements, that would be a violation of the free access to public schools under our Constitution. What we found is a third of the schools that we looked at did have some type of a requirement. It was either a requirement for working, providing actual service hours to the school, or in lieu of that, donations or a fee. And we were also looking at schools that maybe didn't, what we also saw were schools that didn't say that it was required, but then said if you didn't do that, there would be a consequence with regard to enrolling in the school, coming back again, or going on a field trip, or going on special activities. So we partnered with the California Charter Schools Association, who agreed with us that this was not the right thing. This was against the law. And together we went to the Department of Education, and happily the department responded fairly quickly, a couple of months, and issued some guidance to the charter schools. I've passed out a press release that we issued with the Charter Schools Association, and I also attached to that a copy of a news article from the Sacramento Bee that talks about our research as well as the guidance from the Department of Education.
Please tweet at me and check out the blog, Cloaking Inequity. It's a community project where we look at issues of education, public policy, and race. I guess let me fly past the introduction. So just a quick overview. I always like to know where we're going. First, I'll talk a little bit about charters and achievement. Then I'll talk about charters and access. And then I'll conclude with a few thoughts. So what is my positionality on charters? I'm actually a former charter school instructor aide at the East Palo Alto Charter School. I'm a former charter school parent. I'm a former charter school board member. And I publish research on charter schools in peer-reviewed academic journals. How do charters compare to traditional public schools nationally? A lot of you probably remember the film Waiting for Superman. Do you remember that film? Yeah, that was the film that told us that charter schools, Teach for America, those are the things that were going to solve poverty. The first half of the film was about poverty. The second half of the film was about charter schools and Teach for America. That was Superman, right? Do you remember that film? So how do charters perform? Now, there's a lot of debate about the Credo study. Some of you have heard about or read about the Credo studies. Only one of you. So two. Okay, so the Credo studies are probably the most prominent studies on charter schools. They're actually conducted down at Stanford at the Hoover Institute, which is typically a more conservative outfit. But they've conducted 2 research studies on charter schools. And what they do is they look at charter schools and schools that are close by, nearby schools, not the overall state averages. And what they found is that 85% of charters actually perform no better than the traditional public schools in their neighborhood, which is kind of shocking, right? Because if you turn on the TV, if you look in the newspaper, there's a completely different narrative about charter schools. On my blog today, I blogged about Buicks. Why was I blogging about Buicks? I was blogging about Buicks because the Buick Regal was recently named by Consumer Reports one of the top 10 cars of 2015. Beat the BMW, that's pretty rare. It hasn't happened in like a decade, I think. And so, but when I say Buick or I say car, does that automatically conjure high quality, efficiency, if I say the word car? Because there's a lot of different cars. There's Buicks, there's Hyundais, there used to be Pontiacs. There's all different types of cars, right? But we're in an era today where when you say the word charter, that it means brilliant, right? And so, but if we look at the research, if you look at the data, if you look at the national data, you can see that only 15% of charters perform better than our traditional public schools. So what are the results in California? Just really quickly, the Credo study says that there's actually a negative effect in math, a small positive effect in reading. In states like Arizona, charters have a full 2 months of negative impact. Nevada have a full 2 months of negative impact in math and reading. Texas, a full month of negative impact. There are some states where there is more positive impacts, but the bottom line is that charters are quite different. It's a really heterogeneous sector, if you let me use one of those big academic GRE words. So there was a piece in the Boston Globe today, and the piece talked about how charter schools were essentially the silver bullet. They're, of course, a silver bullet because they've solved poverty, they've solved school discipline, they've solved our issues of teacher quality, right? But are charter schools that silver bullet? If you look at the data, not necessarily the case. But often, folks will cite 1 or 2 studies. They do the same thing with voucher schools. So I looked at the studies that the columnist for the Boston Globe cited, and the study looked at 6 charter schools. So can you imagine if we conducted a study on 6 traditional public schools and said, look at these 6 schools. That means that all the traditional public schools in the state of California are fantastic because we studied these 6. That's a sleight of hand, I think. So we have to be careful when we look at research and when folks cite research. What we're really interested in is the predominance of the research literature. What do a set of studies tell us about any given thing in educational policy? Quick example is pre-K. We have decades of research on pre-K that shows that you get a near, let me be the stats professor for just a minute, you get a full standard deviation of improvement in students that go to pre-K. It's one of those gold standards in the research literature. That is the predominance of the research literature. But what you will see is folk cherry-picking study, whether they cherry-pick the Credo study or they cherry-pick a particular study from the Boston Foundation that the Boston Globe wants to talk about. What we're really interested in for making good public policy is the predominance of the peer-reviewed research literature. So don't let folks cherry-pick studies. So I'd like to talk about one of the most interesting research papers I've read recently. It's Kevin Wellner's Dirty Dozen. And Kevin Wellner's a good friend, executive director of the National Education Policy Center. If you haven't been to the National Education Policy Center website, you should. Because about just any issue out there in ed policy, including K-12, Kevin Wellner is actually one of the national experts on the research relative to K-12 and other online charters. So if you're interested in more research, sort of the outcomes, the data related to K-12, check out Kevin Wellner's work at the National Education Policy Center. But he did a really interesting piece called The Dirty Dozen, right? And this is academics making the work that we do more accessible. So there are several ways that charters tamper equity and access. Some of them I'll refer to public advocates' work, have conversations with gentlemen from the ACLU about several of these. But these are the things that I believe we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about legislation for charters, thinking about accountability, thinking about access and equity. The first is description and design. Which niche? There's a lot of folks that say, well, we want charters because, well, we want the private school experience for our kids. We want them to learn only the Greek classics, etc. Right? This is a niche thing. It's a public school. Basically, we get a private school for free. Is that what we want for public schools? Do we want public schools that have requirements for entry or a baseline where you must leave if you don't have a 2.0? Is that the public good that we believe our generation, the coming generations of children, should have access to? Location, location, location. It's often been recognized by the courts that the sitting of a school is an effective way to influence student demographics. You see this in a place like San Antonio, Texas, where you have Arizona charter schools coming in that are this for-profit, nebulous, non-profit, which was interesting hearing about K-12, that the principals are actually employees of K-12 Incorporated. That didn't make anyone else feel really uncomfortable that a nonprofit was run by a for-profit representative? How is that allowed? So I think that's it's really important for us to understand that the locations of these schools are also very important and often purposeful. Charters decide their footprints. We are talking about charters choosing, and I'll come back to that, but charters can decide what their footprints are going to be. And so what happens is if you're not in that footprint or whatever criteria they've set up, then you're out of luck. Mad Men, the power of marketing and advertising. There's also a lot of conversations. If you don't want to attract Latino students, especially ELLs, then all you have to do is avoid marketing and communicating in Spanish. One of my students did a research study on ELL access to charter schools. And the charter said, well, we're not set up to be a bilingual school. And they didn't mean bilingual as in bilingual education. They meant we're not set up to communicate with people who speak Spanish. That's what they meant. The Justice Department called some charter schools in New Orleans. They spoke only in Spanish in Louisiana. I don't know if it was only New Orleans. And the testers, you know how they send testers to do these different things? Some charter schools hung up on the testers. Other charter schools made fun of the people only speaking Spanish, right? And so this is an issue not just isolated to California, but we see it in Texas, we see it in Louisiana, we see it in other places. Hooping it up. Kevin came up with these, so I'm just going to go with it. Conditions placed in applications, discouraging parents who lack the time, resources, or overall commitment to jump through hoops. I actually wrote a comic. I liked Kevin's study so much that I wrote a comic. I made a comic, essentially of a parent talking to a principal about the school and about all the different requirements that you often see that parents have to produce just to enroll in the school. The parent contract that has to be signed or adhered to at KIP, for example, which KIP infamously has their code of conduct, right? All of the different materials that you have to produce and to give to a school just to enroll in a charter. As long as you don't get caught, and this is where the ACLU comes in, illegal and dicey practices, policies that have the effect of discouraging special needs students, and in some communities, minimizing the enrollment of immigrant students. How can we avoid enrolling students that have special needs? Students that are going to cost us a little more. Now, there are some charters that have lots of resources. We were talking about this during breakfast. I went to Making Waves Charter, which is just a little bit north of Oakland. And the principal told me that they spend $1 million in special education each year. $1 million. The reason why they're able to do that is they have big donors from Silicon Valley and other places so that they can provide those resources. When I sat on the charter board at the University of Texas Charter Board, we had a student that needed an aid all day. So it went through the board that we were going to have to find the resources to do it. We had a donor that could do it, and so it happened. But a lot of charters, they don't have those sorts of resources to commit to students that have special needs and that are a little bit more expensive to educate. The bum steer, opportunities for that child will be much richer at the public school down the road. So one of the other findings from one of my students' dissertation is that when students come in the door, they would say, well, you could attend our charter school, but you will receive better services at your traditional public school because of the needs that your child has. Send us your best. Conditions placed on enrollment. Sweat equity contracts from parents. This goes back to the public advocates where basically what was occurring is that they had a policy on their websites, sometimes verbal, that they would require particular numbers of hours to attend the school. Now, the Charter Schools Association initially said, well, there's no proof necessarily that these policies are being enforced, right? But the issue is that there were parents on the calls that said this was enforced in our case and that we were offered the opportunity to pay the money instead of doing the volunteering. Now, you can see that's problematic, and it's problematic under California law. So to the credit of the California Charter Schools Association, they backed off of that and have instructed charter schools not to do this here in California because it's very specific in statute. Not in service, pointing out the unavailability of various resources and services. I often get, because of my blog, I often get complaints from parents of different things that they would like to do in particular charter schools. Parents of less successful students are asked to leave. The charter schools will say, you are going to be grade retained, but if you go to the traditional public school, you'll probably go into the next grade, but if you stay here, we're going to keep you in the 5th grade. There's a lot of work on the discipline issues. There's a really interesting post on my blog from a principal from a NOLA public school that talked about the sort of prison-like practices that the charter school he was the principal of, or the vice principal of, required of the students. Types of hair, walking in lines, this sort of old school disciplinary approaches. And he talked about how in the morning he had just a couple of students that had some disciplinary issues. But there were teachers who only had 5 weeks of training in the summer and then started teaching that fall. By the afternoon, they had sent him 30 to 40 kids for him to supervise because they had no training on classroom management. You can probably guess which organization it was whose teachers were referring their kids to the principal's office because they had no training in classroom management. Then a big issue that's come up just recently is whether charters should or should not have to backfill. You see some of these more elite charters, by the time their senior year comes around, they may have 30 or 40 kids. And then they say, look, 100% of our kids went to college this year. We looked at KIP schools in Texas, and over 10 years, 60% of African American kids left the KIP schools. This is in the Texas data. Okay? you can find it. It's publicly available. And so then Kip will say that 100% of our kids went to college, but 100% of 60%, at least in my stats class, does not add up to 100%, right? And so you have some of these schools where you have this long-term attrition problems. Those are very apparent in the data. That's not to say that traditional public schools don't have attrition problems. They do. But when we looked at the Texas data, the charters had double and triple the attrition rates. Now, there's a recent study by some economists, the same people who were cited in the research study by the Boston Globe paper, who says that KIPP doesn't have an attrition problem, but you can probably see the trend there. On average, charter schools are outperformed by traditional schools. That's just the data, folks. If you look at the Credo study, and there's lots of debates about the methodology of that study, but overall, across the United States, 85% of charters do not perform better than traditional public schools. That's the data. Charters have a choice whether they want to be racially and economically diverse schools that serve ELLs, special education, low ES kids, and continue to serve them. Based on the various admissions and management processes documented in the Dirty Dozen and research across the spectrum, charters can choose their students rather than families choosing their schools. In essence, school choice can be charter schools choose. What will the charter schools in California choose? Will you hold them accountable for equity and access? Will you hold them accountable for graduation, dropout, attrition, and other important measures of student success? So these issues are connected. Teach for America and charter schools are connected. Now, Teach for America will say that the majority of their teachers do not teach in charter schools, but actually 1/3 of all of their folks teach in charter schools. Now, here's what a lot of people don't know about Teach for America. If you want to stay in Teach for America, you have to accept the first offer that comes across the table. So a charter school, so the prevailing wage could be, say, $39,000 to be a starting teacher, okay? But a charter school can offer that teacher $29,000, and they have to accept that offer. And there's evidence from Chicago, folks, the charter schools say that they would not open unless they had the ready access to cheap and temporary labor from Teach for America. That's how the charter school movement and Teach for America have this very challenging, I would say, relationship.
So I want to thank all of the speakers today and the co-hosts, Seth Bramble, that's my name here for the California Teachers Association. Excited to be working with our co-hosts on, a lot of our co-hosts, whether it's Federation of Teachers, Public Advocates, the Labor Federation, ACLU, are working together on different pieces of a legislative package which is described to you on this green sheet. So if you take that out for a second, we'll wrap it up here. And I want to kind of end where we started here, about the need for public accountability at charter schools. I guess I'll start here. 2 of the bills are actually listed in there for you. You have the actual language, and then the other 2 are spot bills at this point, so they're not actually included in here. But I'll start here with Mr. Gibson's bill, Assembly Bill 709. This bill, and a lot of these bills, are inspired in part by the set of standards that were put out by the Annenberg Institute for School Reform last year. But the specific standard here that's being addressed is that charter school governance should be subject to the same open meetings and open records laws that are applied in the traditional public school sector. In California, that would mean the Brown Act, right? That would mean that's that law where you have to post like 72 hours beforehand where your meeting is going to be, and the public can come, and they get to actually even, there's a public comment portion where they get to speak if there's going to be an action that's taken. Additionally, the Public Records Act, which is really about, I get to see how tax dollars are being spent. Additionally, this bill is going to address the Political Reform Act and Government Code 1090, and the stories we heard from Donald and from the educators at California Virtual Academy certainly make clear the need for strong measures with respect to conflict of interest where tax dollars are being utilized, and this will keep the focus on kids and not on profit. Hopefully, well, I may not, but hopefully as I get through all these bills, I'll have time for Q&A, but you may have to come up to me afterwards and do the Q&A because we're running up close to our timeline. The second bill I want to talk about is from Senator Mark Leno, Senate Bill 322. You have the language to that bill, too, because it's also in a more I don't want to say finalized form. These are all works in process. I recognize that, PTA's here, the governor's office, other folks. We certainly want to work with you on these proposals, as all legislative proposals are a work in progress. But this bill here, Senate Bill 322 by Senator Leno, is intended in part to address the standard about ensuring equal access to interested students at charter schools and prohibiting practices that discourage enrollment or disproportionately push out segments of already enrolled students. And also, charter school discipline policies must be fair and transparent. So what is that bill seeking to accomplish? Number one, to eliminate discriminatory admission practices or discriminatory preferences, as well as ensure student due process through compliance at charter schools with the suspension and the expulsion provisions of the Education Code. Something that came up in both Donald's research and from the California Virtual Academy educators who spoke to you was the need to really get better handle on both student turnover and teacher turnover in the charter school environment. So the question becomes, are students getting pulled in by commercials and then leaving because educators have no time to teach? Or what kind of practices might attract and retain the best educators for our children? This proposal really seeks to address some of those questions. The other two proposals, as I mentioned, are spot bills, but I want to certainly let you know where they're heading. Assemblymember Roger Hernandez's bill, Assembly Bill 787, the standard here being addressed is that charter school governance must be representative and transparent. Currently, in the charter school environment, what often happens is if it is being run as or by a nonprofit corporation, that private entity will just put forward 5 names or however many names they're going to put on the governing board, and those names will go before the authorizer. So there's really no accountability to the public, to the community in that process. And so there was a decision made by the National Labor Relations Board. They handle essentially the world of private employees with respect to collective bargaining. That decision essentially said that because the governing board at charter schools is not put there through a public process, that while charter schools may be public schools, that they are also private employers with private employees, which is a difficult thing for folks who have been organizing under the state's collective bargaining law that impacts public employees. In fact, in California, it's very clear within the law, it's very evident that charter schools are to be covered by the state's collective bargaining law that covers all public schools in the state of California. At the same time, here's this national entity weighing in saying, well, if your governing board is not put there in a public way, there's a problem here. You have private employees. In fact, as the teachers from California Virtual Academy were unionizing, that was the response letter that came from CAVA management, was essentially asserting that the PERB, our state's, the body that oversees the Education Employment Relations Act, our state's collective bargaining law, should defer to the national. And in making that assertion, what they're saying was, in truth, we are a private employer. We have private employees. And so we seek to resolve this issue once and for all by making charter school governance more public and ensuring that all public schools, whether they are a traditional public school model or whether they are a charter school model, have governing boards that are either publicly elected or that are put in place by elected officials who are accountable to the voters, who are accountable to the community. And so lastly here, Senator Tony Mendoza's bill, Senate Bill 329, accountability. The standards that are being addressed here are to monitor and improve oversight of charter schools to protect the public interest, and that these activities need to be fully state-funded and have the power to vigorously enforce standards. Accountability does start with the authorizer. And this bill really starts a conversation about defining the capacity of an authorizer to do effective oversight. One of the things that I did note in looking through the report that in the public interest put together on page 43, I wrote it down here, that there is a school there, CAVA as a whole is a school, but one entity there, CAVA San Diego, one piece of the pie, has 3,000 students, and they're authorized by, in California, you can be authorized by a school district, by a county office, by the state board. They're authorized by Spencer Valley Elementary District that has 30 students. So again, this is a school with 30 students authorizing a school that serves 3,000 students, do they have any kind of capacity to do the oversight that they need? What's needed here is that we need to define what the capacity is of an authorizer to do effective oversight. So we're going to start that conversation. That's a difficult conversation. Another piece that will occur in that proposal is looking at ways to prevent conflicts of interest, like a couple examples requiring competitive bidding, looking at self-dealing. Competitive bidding, I mean, we mentioned earlier that the head of schools at CAVA is employed by K-12 Inc., who's, CAVA is required to use K-12 Inc. There's some interesting issues there when you don't have competitive bidding requirements in the law. Additionally, looking at self-dealing and what that might look like. Now, I think that's a pretty big conversation, and I would really welcome opportunities to collaborate and work together on different ways to look at some of these conflict of interest issues. But we are moving forward on that. The speakers today might be able to stick around if you want to connect with them to get some more information. But I really want to thank you for coming to participate in today's informational briefing that was focused, yes, on concerns with the corporate model of online learning, but also truly the need for public accountability standards in the charter school environment. Enjoy your weekend.